I don't seem to have the capacity to be able to share my screen, unfortunately.
Alrighty, no, that's all good. Alrighty, here we go. Now you're co-host, so you should be able to now, I think.
Okay, yep.
Brilliant. Alrighty, well, yeah, thank you very much for coming along, and I'll hand over to you.
Good evening, everyone. Hopefully you can see my screen. Great, thank you.
Yep.
Well, thanks for inviting me here today. I'm Rachel. I'm the CEO at Humane Research Australia. I'm going to touch on a few topics today. I hope it doesn't repeat everything that you've already covered in the course, but there might be some overlap, but I hope you still find it of interest. And the perspective I'm going to be sharing is that of Humane Research Australia, and from my experience working here. I've been with the organisation about 2 years now. So today I'm just going to give a brief overview of HRA for those of you who are not familiar with our work, a bit of an overview of animal research in Australia, just touch on the relevant legislation, some context from our perspective on animal welfare concerns and our concerns in relation to scientific validity of using animal models, put forward some recommendations for legislative reform. And just to note that the focus of this presentation will be on biomedical research, and there is also legislation and further discussions on animal use in cosmetics or veterinary research or testing of chemicals, for example, but really our focus has been on biomedical research, and that's the most prevalent sector within Australia. So I've kept it confined to that for the purposes of this presentation. But if you wanted to ask questions more broadly, then feel free during the Q&A. So an introduction to HRA, we're a non-profit member-based organisation in Melbourne. We're a pretty small team of 4. Our mission is to advocate for scientifically valid and humane non-animal methods of research. We recognise that there is a dominant narrative that animal research or animal experimentation is a necessary evil. We really exist to provide an antidote to that with scientifically informed counter-narratives. And how we do that, really, it's scrutinising the research that is taking place, dissemination of information, and engagement with different stakeholders. So we provide a range of different resources. We have a podcast, social media, videos, reports, an e-news, media releases, a whole range of different channels. We're a campaigning organisation, but as well as a campaigning organisation, we're a resource for those who are interested in this subject. So it may be students, or it could be researchers, or universities, or members of animal ethics committees. We have quite a broad database of people who are interested in this topic. So I'm going to provide a bit of an overview here of the use of animals in research and education in Australia. And really, the lack of reporting means it's very difficult to create a comprehensive picture. So each state and territory may have differences in how they collect information. Some may collect information, some may not, some may report it, others may not, may report to different timeframes, cover different species, categorize, impact in different ways. So it makes it very difficult to, I guess, monitor trends and have a national picture. We have been doing an approximation of the animal use statistics, but it's based on averages from when states did publish information and a more accurate information from those that do publish it. But the most recent one is 2018, so quite out of date. And we were really finding that there just seemed to be a reliance that we would be doing this as a not-for-profit organisation. And so really we've said that this will be the last year, 2018 stats, that we will be doing this, and hoping that will push federal government to have a national system of oversight. So from the statistics that we have been able to approximate, generally it's about 10 million animals used per year. And that does vary. Some years there could be double that, and that could be because there's been a large number of observational studies or agricultural research. So there could be one particular type of research that really alters that. And generally it's about between 3 and 5 million, which are more invasive research. So Australia's typically one of the world's highest users of animals for scientific purposes, but we are generally fourth after the US, China, and Japan. But again, there may be differences in reporting. So some countries may not be reporting conservation research or environmental research, which we do, the states that do report include that. So there is some discrepancies there, and it's not all invasive research. So the species, it includes rodents, farm animals, fish, non-human primates, dogs, cats, and wildlife, and other animals in addition to these. There's a national code, which I'll touch on a bit later, which is a system of self-regulation, and there are various funders. So the main ones are the National Health and Medical Research Council and Australian Research Council, Medical Research Future Fund, and then there's different trusts and foundations and university and funds and international collaborations, so multiple funders. And in terms of a breakdown of what that funding may look like in terms of animal versus non-animal research, the NHMRC don't disclose this information publicly. This was obtained through a question posed in the Senate. So their response was that during 2019 to 20, approximately $380 million was expended on grants that indicated that they require animal ethics review. So that was about 40% of the total funding. And the times where we've had that question answered, it's generally for the NHMRC around 40% of the total funding. So most research in Australia falls under what's called basic research or fundamental research, really trying to understand different disease mechanisms. This is a little bit easier for us to obtain information about, typically conducted at universities, and there'll be research publications or research repositories where we can delve into to some degree about what is happening, and that's a bit more easy for us, less challenging for us to find out information about than pharmaceutical research here, because the publications are not always in the public domain for business reasons, or the animal research may be funded by an Australian company but conducted overseas. We've got many case studies on our website. We have them by species, so that's profiling research that's taken place in Australia and generally listing our objections to it. And we also have non-animal case studies, so research that's maybe using computer modeling or human population studies or a whole range of different technologies as well. So before I move to the legislation, I just wanted to touch a little bit on the 3 Rs, and you may be familiar with those just because this is really our foundation of what most legislation related to animal experimentation is globally. So the 3 Rs being replacement, reduction, and refinement. And as an organization, we find this quite an outdated concept. We're seeing very limited replacement and more of a focus in terms of refinement and reduction. And really just not, it's an animal welfare principle, but it's not really sufficient to make sure that the research has sufficient scientific value. And there's a few suggestions about adding some Rs to the 3 Rs. Rehoming, relevance, robustness, registration, and reporting are some suggested Rs that could be added. So turning to legislation, each state will have their own Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act or Animal Welfare Act, and to various degrees, they will incorporate the Australian Code for the Care and Use of Animals for Scientific Purposes into that legislation. And there will be some differences, particularly in how they define scientific research or small details such as, does a breeder require a license? That will vary according to each state and territory, so it's not entirely consistent, but generally on the principles of the code. Currently, many of the state acts are undergoing review. So at this point in time, I'm aware of New South Wales, Queensland, and Victoria reviewing their legislation, so that will also have an impact on their animals in science regulations. New South Wales at this current point is unique because they have an Animal Research Act, but they will be in the process at the moment of condensing that into their national act combined with animals in exhibitions. So they're undergoing a period of consultation at the moment. So that won't have that unique setup. And then under the state acts, they may be more detail, so housing guidelines, for example, and then there's additional NHMRC guidelines in addition to that central code. So there's guidelines for use of primates and kind of best practice guidelines for animal use in medical research. So it's quite convoluted, and a few differences between states and territories. So this statement here, this is something that we receive the standard response on an almost daily basis. So I could quite comfortably write the standard response myself. So the welfare of every animal is continuously monitored and recorded. The outstanding facilities provided to support animal research in Australia are governed by individual state and territory legislation, ensuring the highest standards. So that is really what the regulators and researchers would like to present this position. And so our concerns in terms of animal welfare, when you look at the states that do break down at their use and their statistics and what procedures the animals are being used for and the impact, death is an endpoint, and that is defined as where animals will die as part of the experiment. So they haven't been humanely euthanized. It's requiring them to die as part of it. So it could be lethal dosage testing, or it could be pest control testing and major physiological challenge. They would be the minority of procedures, thankfully. And there's sometimes, depending on the state, there'll be some limitations to those that might require ministerial approval in some cases. So there is some oversight of the most extreme suffering. However, there are animal welfare implications associated with routine laboratory animal use. So in terms of taking blood samples and housing and removing from social groups, or keeping dogs in solitary cages, for example, there's a whole range of concerns that, regardless of the procedure, they're associated with laboratory animal use. We have considerable concerns with a range of specific procedures, and these include the forced swim test, smoke inhalation research, lethal dose research, traumatic brain injury, and I guess it shouldn't be forgotten that a lot of research is trying to replicate human conditions that can be very painful. So if it burns research or arthritis research or cancer research, it's going to be creating a painful condition in an animal. And then we have concerns related to it's permitted under legislation for non-vets to be performing surgery, which wouldn't happen in other cases. Lack of reporting about pain relief, and the requirement to only have access to a vet rather than a vet on site. And because of the nature of animal research, it's difficult to know if there has been animal welfare abuses or how prevalent it is, because the infringement information isn't commonly available. But we have conversations with researchers who express their concerns that animals are being kept beyond the point where it would be humane to keep them and they should have been euthanized, but they're being kept for the purposes of completing a research. Or we've done freedom of information requests and uncovered that primates have been found in the breeding facility dying in a pool of their own blood. So it doesn't instill confidence that there is these high standards of animal welfare in all cases. And scientific validity is another core concern for us. And I think it's important to recognise that our position is not that no useful knowledge has been gained from animal research, because there has been useful knowledge gained. It's more a case of that there's evolved methods now that we could use that are relevant to human biology. And it's quite interesting because animal research has never been validated as a research method. It's just kind of being, I guess, used and then seen as a gold standard, whereas non-animal methods, there's very stringent validation requirements before they can be accepted. And when you're looking at claims of animal research, I think, and how reliable it is, there's specific criteria that should be met. So the data must be reliably and sufficiently translatable to human experiments. It must have been provided, the data provided in ways that couldn't have been obtained elsewhere, and it must be crucial to ultimate human benefit. And criticisms of animal models range from lack of reproducibility and reliability, the potential of dismissal of drugs due to animal reactions which may not be replicated in humans, wasted time and costs, and false hopes for patients. And systematic reviews highlight lack of translation. So I think there's a lot of cases where it's anecdotal information. You might hear this drug was developed because of the use of animals, or animals obstructed the development of this drug. But the systematic reviews really highlight a lack of translation, and it's also evident from the high failure rates of clinical trials, which I think is about 90 to 93%. And the way a lot of these reviews work is that they might look at citation analysis. So has that research then been further cited in medical research or medical literature, or breakthroughs reporting? That you hear about a lot of medical breakthroughs, but if it's reviewed, say, for example, 20 years later, the very, very small minority will have actually resulted in a breakthrough, unfortunately. And we find that much animal research is really leading to more animal research and more publications, just a different iteration of the previous research rather than patient outcomes. So I'm just going to try and share a quick video. This is one of our current campaigns, and it's an example of where we're critiquing, go back, based on animal welfare and scientific validity. So I'm going to give a overview here. It's quite an old publication. This is an example of one of our case studies and publicly funded research. I'm just providing this as an example of why we object to some of the research. So this was a research looking into rats exposed to a cafeteria diet and looking at obesity. So 24 rats were randomly assigned either a standard lab chow or a high-fat cafeteria diet. This received over $400,000 of NHMRC, so that's public funding. The necessity of this experiment was approved by the Animal Care and Ethics Committee of the University of New South Wales. And the result was that the rats preferred pies, dim sums, biscuits, and lamingtons to standard chow. They snacked more frequently and they weighed more at the conclusion of the experiment. And I'm not sure about you, but I think that they're all quite obvious results that we really did not need to conduct that research to obtain. So was the research justified? Was there no suitable alternative? Numerous human studies have already been conducted. Repetition, almost identical rodent studies already conducted. Does this project obtain and establish significant information relevant to the understanding of humans and or animals? I would argue no. And could that money have been used better? And then there's the issue of the validity of rats as models of human snacking behavior because of their different gastrointestinal pathway, how they metabolize, absorb, and distribute food. So as I said, this is a fairly old one, but we have many case studies. And when we prepare case studies, we look at recent publications and we obtain feedback from various different scientists or experts in that field of research. And we may find that it's repeating existing knowledge, or it's irrelevant research, or it's, as I said, it's could have been obtained by using other methods. So now just turning to the code. So this is an ethical framework and really setting out principles for those who may be involved in various capacities in animal research. And it's a form of self-regulation because it's up to the institution that's conducting the research to form an animal ethics committee and approve the research and really monitor compliance with that code, rather than the author of the code, which is the NHMRC in collaboration with Australian Research Council and Universities Australia. So the principles are, sorry, I'm just going to minimize my screen so I can read this. So respect and care for animals and must be subjected to ethical review. And judgment on whether the proposed use of animals is ethically acceptable must balance whether the potential effects and the well-being on the animal, so cost-benefit analysis, and then obligations to respect animals in terms of their welfare, which are all very good principles in theory. And I think an important part to realise is the project only has to have potential benefit. And as to the practice of it, that's another thing. So in terms of our criticisms of the code, so HRA's criticisms, some of it relates to the ambiguity of the terms used, and you've probably come across this in other areas of animal law as well, in terms of how do you define scientific or educational merit or suitable or necessary. It's largely self-regulatory with questionable enforcement of compliance. As I said, it's the institutional's Animal Ethics Committee, and they will have a lay person and an animal welfare person on it, but they are likely to be the minority, and there may be, I guess, cultural reasons why they may not be able to speak out against some practices. And then there would be oversight by a regulator, but it might be that they have an inspection every 4 years, or they, and that's always with advance notice. And the other problem is that funding is allocated before the AEC approval. So that's really the final stage. So it's very difficult for an AEC to approve research when they've had a very lengthy and arduous process to get to that point. There's a recommendation that institutions consider making accessible their external compliance reports, but I haven't seen an instance where that has been made publicly available. And there is really a reluctance to ban any procedures. The code is quite generic. It's expecting researchers to adhere to best practice, and from their perspective, they don't want to be updating the code every year. It's a very lengthy process to update a code, so they want it to maintain longevity for a period of time. So it will be quite broad, but I don't think that there's enough oversight of whether researchers are taking account of, for example, alternatives to using animals in antibody production, or the inhalation research. So state and territory legislation key features. We have on our website links to all the current legislation, and the general things that you'll find in common is that the use and supply of animals requires a license. Animal ethic committees are set up to review them. There's incorporation of the code of practice in some degree through the acts or the associated regulations. It may be incorporated through compliance being a condition of the license, enforced under the act or the regulation, or as a defence or exemption to prosecution. And another feature will generally be inspection of the research facilities, usually that on a 4-year basis. So currently New South Wales is unique in having a dedicated Animal Research Act and a research review panel. I think the research review panel will continue, but the act will be consolidated. And then each state may have different applications of species that are covered. So some may require fish to be considered as ethics approval for research, others may not, similar for crustaceans or cephalopods. So the issues that we have with the state legislation is that there are inconsistencies between the jurisdictions. There's minimal independent assessment. The interaction between the Ministry of Health and Agriculture is quite limited, and much of the regulation will fall upon the Ministry of Agriculture. Some states it might be Ministry of Environment or Economic Development, but generally the ministry that's handling other animal welfare issues such as livestock. And that means that there's limited ability to be able to evaluate in terms of was the research justified scientifically, because those government representatives are unlikely to have the skills to be able to do that. Similar with the code, was a qualification. And then a central issue is conflict of interest. So a recent example was, it came to light that I think University of Sydney conducted some veterinary training without Animal Ethics Committee approval, which is in contravention to the code. And it took place at a New South Wales Department of Primary Industries facility. And then they were tasked with really investigating themselves. And their own report stated that there was a subsequent failure of the investigation process by New South Wales DPI under its accreditation to detect and act on the problems, demonstrating a failure of effective self-regulation under the Animal Research Act. And in terms of enforcement, it is quite difficult to give a full summary of our opinion on enforcement because there is limited transparency as to the infringements and notifiable incidents that have been reported. Currently in New South Wales, one of the issues is that inspectors authorised under the Animal Research Act have limited evidence gathering powers because the legislation is so old. That is set to be changed with the revised, so we'll hope that will bring in more information, more requirements for digital documentation and so on. And in terms of prosecutions, I think this is an indication, I guess you could see it in two ways. It could just be that everything is perfect and there's been no need to be prosecutions, or that there's been limited ability to be able to track if there was any prosecutions necessary. So in New South Wales, there has been one in relation to animal supply for research, and there's been one case in Northern Territory which was dropped. And the recent example I gave about the University of Sydney, the maximum penalty that could be applied would be losing the license and I think a 6-month prison sentence. But all that happened was that the trainer involved was suspended. So how would HRA rate the regulatory framework? Does the regulatory framework provide adequate protection for animals? Largely, this is up to the individual institutions and researchers, self-regulation. So does it achieve what it aims to achieve? Without independent oversight nor reporting mechanisms in place, it is hard to say, but from the case studies that we've compiled, we really question the examples of justifiable use. Does the regulatory framework mandate the use of alternatives or replacements where available? So justification must be provided, but it's not mandated. So the language that is used is that methods that replace or partially replace the use of animals must be investigated, considered, and where applicable, implemented, which is not the same as mandating it. Do these mechanisms and policies adequately promote the development and validation of non-animal replacements? We would say no. So in terms of what we would like to see, I think some practices from the EU and other countries which we would like to see incorporated here, and that would be non-technical summaries of the research that's been conducted, particularly publicly funded research available, and retrospective analysis of research so that it can be fairly assessed what the outcome of that research was. We'd like to see a dedicated funding or alternatives validation institution in Australia. This is something that the Senate recommended, I think, in 1987 and still waiting to happen. A centralised national authority to oversee implementation of the code and coordination of AEC projects, because there's so much variances between what different AECs would approve or wouldn't. Knowledge sharing to reduce unnecessary repetition of research, greater transparency and accountability. Really crucially, a nationally consistent and reliable procedure for reporting and publishing annual statistics. Clearer definitions in both the code and state legislation. All applications to provide evidence that the researchers have sought an alternative. An independent office for animal welfare, and we would like to see some procedures prohibited. And in terms of what actions we take in the, I guess, legislative space, we contribute to legislative reviews. We always put submissions in when they're open for review and reviewing the code as well. We're hoping that will be reviewed fairly shortly, but that really is up to the states and territories to request that a review is needed, and generally they're quite hesitant to do that. Education, so in terms of website content, talks, webinars, communication materials, briefings to politicians. We have some related campaigns. So one of our campaigns is the Right to Release, which is promoting the mandatory adoption of dogs and cats after they've been used in research, and greater transparency. And we've just actually started a new project where we have a legislative consultant, and she's looking at reviewing the current framework and putting forward a platform for reform and developing a toolkit that we can use to advocate for this purpose. So that's just a project that just started last week. And that brings me to the end. So thank you very much for listening. I've provided a few links here, and I'll make the presentation available to everyone, and you have the recording, but we have a range of different means by which you can follow us. And I'm very happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Rachel. That was really great. And I think it ties really nicely into not only some of the themes that we talk about this week, but a few of the issues that we've been considering right across this term. So yeah, that was really nice. And mate, yeah, grateful for your time. I'll open the floor up. Are there any questions for Rachel?
Rachel, you mentioned that your group is looking at legislative reforms.
Mm-hmm.
It seems that there's been some trouble in America with a lot of biomedical research, and there was a moratorium put on funding. Do you think it's better to try and have the government stop the funding of unethical research or things that are replicated, and going about it that way rather than the legislative way?
I think that the funding is quite crucial, because researchers will follow the funding. So if there's funding available for alternatives, then that's what researchers will look into doing. So I think that would be an effective way of doing it. And there's a lot of the research that's taking place is not necessarily in the university's basic research. There isn't really a legislative hurdle because there's no legal requirement for them to use animals in that sense. So it's other kind of culture and the peer reviewers and lack of knowledge about alternatives that are maybe impeding them. So I think it's legislative reform, but it's also changing the culture and providing information and examples, and setting up scholarship programs or exchanges, and part of that is also the funding bodies recognizing that there's new principles and ways of doing things that are available, because there's some hesitancy there when we speak with the National Health and Medical Research Council compared to other countries, I think.
Yeah, that seems like a good point, because yeah, you're not going to pick up the pharmaceuticals and that and the people that have a lot of the funding from the private perspective rather than the public. There was another question I had as well. I can't think of it at the moment, so I'll let someone else go.
Okay, thank you.
If there's no other takers at the moment, I might jump in with a quick question. I think a really interesting theme that cut through a lot of your presentation was around information and access to information. And I know your master's thesis was on freedom of information as well. So, you know, it's pretty clear that you think more information would be a good thing, which I think is right. But I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about what the significance of that is and what benefits would come from having more information in this space.
I think it's just so that there can be reasonable public debate about it, because you can't really assess an issue unless there's information available. We will hear quite vague statements. Our primates are essential for research into XYZ condition, but no more detail about as to what research has taken place and what that concretely led to. So I just think to have informed public debate and to monitor if there has been trends, and if there was detailed information published, then we'd be able to assess, this research took place, but there is a validated alternative for this, and then we could challenge it, but we don't get that level of detail to be able to do that. One development is that recently in New Zealand, the research institutions there, they signed up to a kind of openness agreement where they are committed to being more open, which I think is a good thing. And there is currently a draft circulating in Australia, which the research institutions are considering. So there may be a development there. And I guess any information that people present could be selective, but if there was recommendations about what should be provided, even just making your annual compliance reports publicly available is a requirement rather than optional, then at least everyone would be in the same boat and providing the same information, rather than selectively, selecting information that may support their point or otherwise.
Awesome, thank you. Any other questions?
Yes, it's not, excuse me, it's not really a question. I just wanted to give my opinion in regards to the reform that you have suggested, like maybe for the reports to be made more public and more accessible. If the industry is self-regulated, those reports might be biased, and I don't think, just putting them out there would make much difference, because if the reports are biased or corrupted because, they come from self-regulators, whether they go public or not, it wouldn't make any difference.
Yeah, but I guess some of the content, even if it would be, if you do get access to them, it might be the number of projects that they approved or the species, or so you would get some information which they couldn't really alter. That was just factual information would still be in there, or how many projects did they ask further questions about, how many did they reject, that kind of thing would be factual to some degree, and some of it would also be that they would make their external inspection reports by the regulator publicly available as well.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah. But I do agree. I mean, it could be construed that in a certain way to highlight the benefits of what they've been doing, but some information would still at least be factual.
Rachel, are all countries self-regulating, or are some countries doing a better job of oversight?
Some of them have a kind of combination. So in the UK, they have an animal ethics committee and they approve research, but then it all goes to the Home Office and they have to also give their approval. So there's oversight up above and beyond their own animal ethics committee. So that's what we're suggesting here. They can still have their own one, but to have more consistency and more oversight, a body overseeing that. So here really it's just the license that's approved, but in the UK it's a license, and then the particular, every project that they do has to be approved as well.
And I did remember the other question I had, which was,
yeah.
do you think that it's you're sort of having a bit of trouble because of the, I guess, the respect and the trust that most of the medical fraternity has, particularly in biomedical research, and the difficulty, I guess, in assessing some of their technical summaries and that sort of thing? Because you did mention the need for the non-technical summaries.
Yeah, but I mean, sometimes we can't be an expert on everything, and some of them are very complicated, the neuro research they do or the eye research. But we have a science consultant and we have a team of advisors, so we can generally get an idea of what they're doing. But the non-technical summaries, I think, is something they have in the EU, and every project that is approved in an EU country has to have a non-technical summary, and it's all published on a website, so anyone can go and see what's being conducted and what the purpose of it is. So I think that would be more value to just the everyday member of the public to be able to see what they're funding with their tax dollars, really.
Yeah, and just finally, I mean, we all know that cigarette smoke is bad for humans or anyone, let alone mice. So yeah, I think that's hard to justify. So yeah, thanks for that. I wouldn't have thought that anyone would even consider doing that.
I mean, what they're typically doing is broader, that it will be they will be giving a particular intervention and they're inducing the condition and then looking at very specific aspects. So if they give a certain type of antioxidant, will that have an impact? Or if they give this injection, will that do something? So it's more than just whether the smoke has been dangerous or not, but they're just using the smoke to try and induce the same condition. But there's just so many differences between how they're causing that condition in the animal, because they don't inhale smoke in the same way, and they're doing it 5 days a week for a certain period of time. So it doesn't mimic human smoking, and a whole range of different factors which make it questionable. But yeah, it's more than just whether cigarette smoking is bad or not. I don't think they would be able to do that. But there is actually a lot of research going into e-cigarettes as well, and whether it impacts on future generations and that kind of thing. So that's quite a growing field as well.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Hey, Rachel, what happens with these companies when they breach the code or the legislation? Do they get issued infringement notices? And considering all the restraints on the investigators, how do they actually issue these notices and uphold them?
Yep, so there's a range of different things. So the institution themselves, if they have done what they would call a notifiable incident, maybe an animal has died inadvertently or there's been a mistake made, they have to report that themselves to their own animal ethics committee and then report that in their report, which they don't always publish, as I said. And then if we were to ask the regulators for a summary of the infringements that have been made, they would refuse to provide that information to us.
Why is that the case? Because someone who works for a government agency and who issues infringement notices, that's part of the freedom of information. Even if it's not specific, we still have to provide generic information in terms of how many and what and why.
Yeah, they would probably just say that it's a risk to the safety of that particular institution, or it's business confidentiality, or it could damage the reputation of the industry. They would use a whole range of different exemptions. But as I said, there's only been one case where I think that they temporarily lost their license. But I think most of the cases, it will be just a warning or a caution or a suspension of a staff member, but certainly not anything like a prison sentence or. And I think if they had a financial penalty, it would be so minor, especially for the pharmaceutical companies, that would just be really, I guess, absorbed as the cost of doing business if they were to get such a small fine like that, that it wouldn't really be much of a deterrent.
So are there penalty amounts prescribed under the legislations? Because I know it's very standard to get a 20 or a 50, and that's, I mean, they're not small. They're still about $13,000, $20,000, $25,000 a hit.
Yeah. I was just trying to think of the one I looked at most recently was the New South Wales one, and they're increasing the amount, but it's pretty unclear whether for the animal research ones, when they break an infringement, there's probably related to a range of different things that they could have done. like not having systems in place, not having an animal ethics committee approving research without it, and whether they would do an infringement for all those or just one. But there's very few cases to be able to give a precedent. So the only one, as I said, has been for a supplier breeding a supplier who bred without and supplied animals without a license, not actually the research institution itself. So I just cannot imagine that whatever they did, they would remove the research license of a major institution like University of Sydney. I can never foresee that happening, regardless of what the incident had been, unfortunately.
So is it because there's just a lack of resources? Like there's a lack of investigators? Obviously,
I think part of it is to do with that. Yeah, they will have a government vet who's doing the inspections, who's a public servant. And with New South Wales, we uncovered, reading one of their reviews, for about a period of a year, they didn't even have a vet. So no one was doing the inspections because they couldn't maintain someone in that position. So, and I think with COVID, a lot of site visits that were cancelled as well. So a lot of them have not been having the inspections that they were due to be having. And as I said, it's very difficult for the inspector they'll be looking at paperwork and the caging and different things, but they're not really able to make an informed opinion about whether that research was justified or not. They're just going on what the Animal Ethics Committee has approved. So that's a massive gap as well in terms of the assessment of the research and the license.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Any other questions? Awesome. Well, if you think of something, overnight or over the next few days, feel free to, contact me and I can pass your questions on, or Rachel sort of has provided a few contact links as well. But yeah, if there's no final questions, it just leaves me to say thanks again, Rachel, for your time this evening and for sharing your insights with us. It's been really great to have a very practical, hands-on perspective on these issues.
Thank you, and good luck with everyone on the course. Hope you enjoy it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Jacob.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.
Alrighty, well, so that was pretty great to hear from Rachel. I'll be putting those slides up on Moodle tomorrow morning, and then I'll try and get a clearer copy of the video that Rachel played throughout the presentation as well. Any other, I suppose, initial thoughts or reactions to anything that Rachel said before we press on with the last few minutes of the tutorial?
I think I'd just say it's a little scary. It's
Yeah.
very scary, actually, what's going on, and that it's self-regulated. And I think since COVID, we need to question more what research is going on. And I say that because of some of the research that's been going on in areas of animal disease research and that sort of thing, and gain of function research. And yeah, so I think that, you can't just assume that the research that's going on is ethical, and that, mistakes won't be made and that sort of thing, or that even everyone's competent to do what they're doing. And that was the thing that I was sort of very concerned about. And I don't think we can just trust the scientists and the medical fraternity anymore. I know that a lot of them do a good job and do mean well and that sort of thing, but maybe I think some of them might get caught up in their research and not realise, that it can be, harmful.
Yeah, it's a difficult thing, especially as you say with the self-regulation. It does put a range of, I suppose, interests and concerns up against the welfare of the animals, and so that can be really tricky to navigate. The other interesting point that you mentioned that I think sort of flows through from Rachel's presentation is I suppose their attempt to shift the perceptions around when use of animals in research is justified. And in particular, she sort of mentioned, the culture and the expectations from the scientific community around, there's an expectation that animal research will be involved in it, and it is not considered an especially robust study without animal research, unless there's a good reason why some alternative is okay or better. Whereas what Rachel was sort of suggesting in her presentation is that standard should be reversed. It should be that, all these other alternate methods are preferable and are to be used first. And it's only in the sort of the last resort, last instance that that animals should be used. It's an interesting sort of reversal, I think. Any other comments?
But the code does sort of make that point, doesn't it? But obviously the researchers don't really agree with the code on that point, that it's something to not be the first port of call.
It's a difficult one, because I think Rachel's spot on in suggesting that it's a cultural I suppose hangover. It's there are certain beliefs and expectations that are hard to shift. And what's difficult, as well, as Rachel was mentioning, is the ambiguity in some of these words around justified, suitable, necessary. It's when there's an expectation amongst a scientific community that things will be done in a certain way, there's enough ambiguity in those words to to justify using, or justify being one of the ambiguous words, but you can provide a reason that makes it look like it wasn't the first port of call, even if in practice it probably was. So yeah, it's difficult, sort of the way the code is written and the expectations that are set out versus the history of or the expectations of the way things are done, and things like that can be hard to change.
We think that we're very modern and that sort of thing now, but it reminds me a little bit of the history of some medical research, where they used to dig up bodies in cemeteries and that to do human research and medical research on them, and then there was people started murdering other people and then selling the bodies and all this sort of thing. But I mean, you think that things would move on from this sort of thing, and that they'd be a little better than doing that.
Yeah, it's certainly a tricky, and I think what makes it tricky is thinking about some of the more theoretical ideas that we've talked about throughout this unit, thinking about utilitarianism and weighing the interests of animals against humans, and weighing the, I suppose, sanctity of a human corpse against a live animal. It's an equation that I think a lot of people probably would say that we have progressed, and absolutely people feel free to disagree with that view, but yeah, it's a complicated little dynamic, that's for sure. The last thing that I think would be, I suppose, useful for you guys to take away is that, and this wasn't a huge feature of Rachel's presentation, but given that you guys have just completed your own research paper, you've just been thinking yourselves about the way research is conducted, the appropriateness of various methods, and we've discussed in this unit thinking about some methodologies as being more suited to a particular research question than others, obviously in a very different context, but we're seeing a lot of those questions and considerations playing out in Rachel's presentation as well, in terms of thinking about, is the use of animals in research appropriate to the particular research question, and raising all these concerns about, well, mice have very different respiratory systems to humans, rats have different digestive systems, and all these concerns go to the, I suppose, the method by which the research is conducted. And I'd encourage you to sort of draw a parallel to your own experiences with the research papers that you've done and other research papers that you'll do throughout your time at universities, is thinking quite critically about the way that you approach research and making sure that the methods that you're choosing are adapted and are the best fit for the particular research question that you're trying to address. Obviously, not you're probably not going to be going out experimenting on animals or anything, but I think there's an interesting parallel there of thinking about, am I going about this in the best way, and that's going to give me the best answers to the question that I want to answer. An interesting debate in the chat about use of human corpses in research as well, which is good to see. Look, we've got the tutorial questions to go over, but we have hit that 8 o'clock, and I sort of thought that we should definitely allocate as much time as we could to Rachel's presentation, given that that's an experience that we don't often get. So what I'll do, probably not immediately, but in the next couple of days, I'll post up some dot point responses to the tutorial questions, just for you to sort of check that you are along the right track with your thinking of those. And of course, after that or before that, if you've got any questions, comments, or concerns about those tutorial questions or anything that's been covered in this week's topic, of course, feel free to get in touch via email or Moodle or however. Elisa's asked in the chat, when are the marks due back for the research paper? And that's why this won't happen in the next couple of days, or tomorrow. It'll be a couple of days' time. Marking's going well. You can expect those back by Friday afternoon at the latest. If things go really well, you might get them a little bit sooner, but Friday, I think, is probably the most, is probably when it's going to be. So yeah, Friday for those research papers. But yeah, it's been good. There's been a lot of really interesting topics and some interesting perspectives, which is great. And the variety of interest is on full display too, which is really encouraging to see. Perfect. Well, unless there's any other questions, comments, concerns, we might leave that one there.
I just thought it was really good that she explained that in the UK they were doing a better oversight with the Home Office, because see, in Australia in particular, there's several areas where the federal government hasn't been oversighting things, like the Belt and Road thing, where the states were getting involved in foreign affairs and contracts with foreign entities and things like that. So they were sort of stepping on the constitutional power of the government. But I think that, given that I guess it's because of our setup as a federation and the constitution that it's making it difficult for us, because UK doesn't have the same system. But yeah, it looks like that oversight would be handy.
Yeah, it is an interesting theme that we've now seen pop up a couple of times throughout this unit in relation to the lack of a federal power generally for animal welfare. Obviously, there's limited heads of power that we can kind of twist in different ways, but in terms of consistent national legislative schemes, the government is sort of tied by the constitution, which does make things tricky. And yeah, we've seen that playing out again today. Rachel mentioned a few times the sort of the inconsistency of state legislation posing some difficulties. And what's especially difficult, it's hard to know what is going on, which I think was a key point that Rachel made, but it also creates, where one jurisdiction's rules say are a little bit softer, it's easy for a lot of research institutions, not so much the universities, they're a bit more fixed obviously, but a lot of the pharmaceutical companies, they can gravitate to the place where the regulation is going to be most favorable to them, which a national framework obviously squeezes that out. But yeah, you're right. It's a theme that we have seen pop up a few times, is the way that the federalism dynamic is creating problems for animal welfare. Absolutely. Perfect. All righty. Well, we'll call it there. Thanks so much, everyone, for coming along. I hope you enjoyed Rachel's presentation, and we'll be back next week. In the meantime, of course, feel free to reach out with any questions or concerns that you've got. But other than that, have a great rest of the week, and we'll see you next time. Thank you very much. Bye.